now available in paperback. From the author of the critically acclaimed book The Man Crisis comes The Woman Crisis. Learn why so many women have become lost in their quest to have it all in The Woman Crisis. Get your copy of The Woman Crisis in paperback at Amazon.com and online booksellers today. One of my viewers wanted me to do another installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series. Now, this installment in the Historical Women in Crisis series takes us to Hollywood, where I'm going to talk about the tragic story of three actresses, Gail Russel, Barbara Payton, and Veronica Lake. And all three of these actresses became women in crisis when they became alcoholics. Now, everything that led to the tragedy in all three of these women's lives fits everything I wrote in a chapter called Alcoholism and the Woman Crisis. And alcoholism is a major crisis for many of America's women because many American women don't know that alcohol is a drug, and when you become addicted to this drug, it can basically destroy your life. And that's sadly what happened in the case of your Gail Russel, Barbara Payton, and Veronica Lake. They looked to escape from their problems in a bottle, and that sent their lives going straight down the drain. Now, Gail Russell's road to stardom led to her becoming a woman in crisis because she didn't know how to deal with social anxiety. Now, your Gail Russell was a very shy young woman, and she suffered from stage fright, which was basically social anxiety. However, this hadn't been diagnosed by psychotherapists back in the 1930s and 1940s. And because there were no psychotherapists to diagnose your social anxiety that Gail Russell suffered from, your Gail Russell dealt with her social anxiety as related to performing by starting to drink alcohol. Now, she had started drinking after being suggested by the head of the makeup on the set of one of her projects to start drinking to calm herself and deal with her social anxiety. And I talk about how lots of women use alcohol to be able to deal with their social anxiety because the alcohol lowers their inhibitions, and because the alcohol lowers their inhibitions, this gives them the confidence to go out here and be able to do the things that they could not do without that drink of alcohol. Unfortunately, as many of these women gain social successes from drinking, what happens with them is they start to become dependent on this alcohol in order to just go out here and do basic things in life. And sadly, this is what happened in the case of your Gail Russell over the course of 10 years, where she said that there was suddenly this terrific amount of work and no time to herself. And that's how it happens to a lot of introverts. They wind up being able to do a lot of things because they're drinking, and because they're drinking, they have all of this time to do things for other people, but they don't go out here and do the thing for themselves that they need to do, and that is be able to go out here and build up their self-confidence. And sadly, because your Gail Russell depended on alcohol as a crutch to carry her through life, and she became extremely dependent upon this alcohol. And as she became dependent on this alcohol for her to be able to go out here and act in movies, she eventually wound up becoming an alcoholic. And as your Gail Russell became an alcoholic, what happened was she was unable to continue doing work in movies because she was dependent on this alcohol in order to just be able to do basic things like get up in the morning, because that's the way it is for an alcoholic over time. As they become dependent on this alcohol in order to be able to do the things that they want to do in life, it eventually becomes all-consuming in their life, and they become extremely dependent on this alcohol, where they need a drink in the morning. They need a drink in order to just be able to go out here and be able to just eat breakfast, and they need a drink in order to go out here and go to sleep at night. And what most people don't understand is that it's easy to become addicted to alcohol, and that's what happens to many women that leads to them becoming women in crisis, like Gail Russel, because alcohol is considered to be a socially acceptable drug, and because it's considered to be a socially acceptable drug, people go out here and take it on the regular, and they can go out here and buy it any place without a prescription. And because they think that drinking is something that you do in order to be social, it's perfectly normal for you to have drinks on the regular. But the problem is with many female alcoholics is that because women are social, they're drinking all the time, and this is what leads to them winding up in a situation where once they become dependent on the alcohol, it takes them on a slow road to self-destruction. And sadly, that's what happened with your Gail Russel over time. She basically became so dependent on the alcohol that it basically led to the dissolution of her marriage, and it also led to her having several drunk driving incidents. And these drunk driving incidents basically could have been the point for rock bottom. Unfortunately, because she had a lot of Hollywood enablers, these Hollywood enablers kept making excuses for her, and they kept giving her passes. Like one time she was held overnight after being arrested for drunk driving, and that's what led to her divorce, which would have been a moment for rock bottom for many women. But your Gail Russel continued on at 1954 after being arrested in 1953 for drunk driving, where she got a fine for drunk driving, and she promised in lieu of a jail sentence that she would not use alcohol or attend nightclubs. But in that same court session, she got a continuance on a charge while driving drunk again. And this led again to her winding up later on into a coma after an attack of hepatitis, because you get hepatitis from drinking a lot. And what happened was, this wasn't a rock bottom moment for her, sadly. She even went in 1955, hit another car had a couple and a baby, got fined, and then got sued, but still did not have her down to that rock bottom point that many alcoholics wind up in. Now, many alcoholics, they have to hit rock bottom to acknowledge that they have a problem with drinking, and sadly, Gail Russel never acknowledged that she had a problem with drinking, even though she had wound up, again, participating in another drunk driving incident in 1957, where she drove her convertible into the front of a coffee shop and wound up with a 30-day suspended license. She still never really came to rock bottom, and sadly wound up continuing to drink, even though she had lost her marriage. Her career wound up in decline, and she wound up hurting other people. None of these things allowed it to register in her mind that she had a problem with alcohol, and as a result, sadly, your Gail Russel wound up falling further and further into the abyss of alcoholism as she would try to stop drinking, where she was living in a small house by herself. She would try to stop drinking, then she started again. One time she was hospitalized, and sadly, on August 26, 1961, your Gail Russel was found dead in her apartment in Brentwood, California, where at the age of 36, where neighbors were concerned because they hadn't seen her for several days, with an empty bottle of vodka by her side and a house filled with bottles of alcohol. So she had died from liver damage due to acute and chronic alcoholism, and the whole thing was she had drunk herself to death. And she had drunk herself to the death to the point where she was malnourished. So she was basically, again, drinking the alcohol in order to survive, but drinking that alcohol overwhelmed her system, and this is what led to her death. And this happens to many American women out here as they become women in crisis. They start drinking in order to socialize. They start drinking in order to be able to go out here and do basic things. And then eventually, because they've gone out here and had some social successes, eventually what they do is they start drinking in order to just be able to do basic things. And eventually it becomes an addiction to the point where all they do is drink just to get up in the morning. They drink in order to be able to go out here and be able to just go to work. They drink in order to even go to sleep, and the alcohol basically becomes a part of their life. And what's really troubling is that as this person is drinking themselves away, many people don't see this person destroying themselves, because alcohol is considered to be a drug that's socially acceptable. And as people go out here and drink this alcohol, they destroy themselves right in front of us. And that's what happened here with Gail Russel. She became a woman in crisis because she was an alcoholic who never hit rock bottom until she wound up dying at 36 years old. The second woman whose road to stardom led to her becoming a woman in crisis was actress Barbara Payton. And actress Barbara Payton went on the road to becoming a woman in crisis early on in her life, where she was raised in a home by an alcoholic mother and an alcoholic father. And seeing her parents model alcoholism as a social norm, your Barbara Payton learned at an early age that drinking was something people did to be social. And as she went out here looking to go out here and socialize with alcohol, it led to her going from a road to being a housewife to becoming a resident of what I call Bus Downtown. Now, your Barbara Payton had a reprieve from being a part of what her parents' self-destructive behavior with alcohol when she met your combat pilot John Payton, who was stationed at Midland Army Airfield. And John Payton and Barbara wound up getting married. He moved her to Los Angeles and enrolled at USC and was looking to build a life in Southern California under the GI Bill. Unfortunately, your Barbara was restless and feeling confined to the life of being a housewife and did not want to submit to the authority of John Payton. And as she didn't want to submit to your John Payton, what she did was looking to go out here and be empowered by going out here and pursuing a modeling and acting career. Now, your Barbara Payton wanted to go out here and, I believe, pursue this modeling and acting career because her parents were out very social out here, and they had done a lot of this partying and drinking. And as they were doing partying and drinking, she wanted to follow up with this by having this modeling career. And as she went out here having a modeling career, she had a son, John Lee Payton, who was born in 1947. And your Barbara Payton wanted to go out here and try to be a wife and a model. Unfortunately, this wound up straining their marriage because the attention she was receiving from men, I believe, possibly upset her husband. And the fact that she was out here posing and fronting in front of different men. This is something a man who was looking to build a household, he doesn't want to see his wife out there. And this led to the marriage wound up being strained because your Barbara Payton was out here being a fun-loving party girl in the Hollywood scene. And as she was out here in the Hollywood scene, this is what led to the divorce from her husband in 1950. And it possibly was because the husband possibly realized that if his wife is out here acting in movies, she's out here getting turned out by these producers and directors and some of these actors in the affair she was having. And this eventually led to your Barbara Payton winding up losing custody of her son, John Lee Payton, because your John Payton said that his son was being exposed to profane language, immoral conduct, and unwholesome activities, and she failed to provide the boy with a moral education. And this goes back to the point I present in The Woman Crisis about the old African proverb that the late David Carroll oftentimes presented in his videos, where he said, "A race can rise no higher than the moral position of its women, and as the woman goes, so goes the race." And your John Payton basically thought, oh, if my wife has no moral position, this is going to affect my son, and it's going to affect my son's behavior, so I have to go out here and fight for the custody of my son to protect him from being made into an immoral person. And that's why he won custody of his son, because possibly he saw that his son was being impacted by his mother going out here and being turned out by many of these celebrities, producers, and directors on the casting couch, and probably saw all sorts of different men coming in and out of the home where his son was. And this is why he wound up fighting for custody of his son, because his mother was too busy trying to live the Hollywood life, which was basically the pre-feminist lifestyle that many of the so-called modern empowered women want to live. Now, as your Barbara Payton was out here acting and modeling for different projects, she was again becoming more a part of the Hollywood lifestyle and going out here drinking and partying in the Hollywood club scene. And as she was out here participating in the Hollywood club scene, she was becoming more and more dependent on alcohol in order to go out here and function. And as she was out here depending on alcohol and eventually drugs to go out here and function, eventually all of that dependency on alcohol and drugs led to her winding up in a place where she wound up in a state of decline. And that state of decline happened when she met actor Friendshot Tone and then began an affair with B-movie actor Tom Neal. Now, as she was out here and had this affair with Tom Neal, what it led to was a fight between your Neal and Tone at Payton's apartment, which led to Tone winding up in a coma with a smashed cheekbone, broken nose, and concussion. And this whole incident led to your Barbara Payton's career basically ending, because her reputation had been basically tarnished at that point, and with her being known as not only a divorcee, but a person who cheated on the man she was involved with, nobody could trust her to go out here and present a positive image in their movies. And this is what led to the complete decline of your Barbara Payton, as she went from becoming an alcoholic woman in crisis, like I talk about in the chapter Alcoholism and the Woman Crisis, to headed down the road to Bust Downtown. Now, in the chapter Bust Downtown, I call it the last stop for a feminist. And what happened to your Barbara Payton is she wound up becoming one of the first residents of Bust Downtown, a place where women wind up when they have already wound up with their careers ending and have been turned out by all of these different men. Once she's had her career ended and winds up getting turned out by a whole lot of different guys, she winds up in Bust Downtown. And in Bust Downtown, her social marketplace value drops to 50, 60, 70, even 80% off the original social marketplace value that Barbara Payton had when she was with John Payton. When she was with John Payton, she was at the highest of the social marketplace value, but her social marketplace value dropped to the point where, after the whole incident with your Friendshot Tone and Tom Neal, that she basically went from being a woman who was one time considered to be a wife to being a woman who was just turned out by different guys in Hollywood, to now becoming a prostitute who was much in demand because of her being a former actress. And as she went out here being a prostitute, selling her booty for bucks, she was further driving into decline as she became more dependent on alcoholism and drugs, And as she depended more on alcohol and drugs, she wound up in multiple skirmishes with the law, such as arrest for passing bad checks, and eventually an arrest on Sunset Boulevard for prostitution. Now, your Barbara Payton even had the face of hitting what many people would call rock bottom, because going from being a starlet to a harlot, this would be a major drop for many women to say that they need to turn their life around. But instead of looking to turn her life around, your Barbara Payton decided to go and commit to the slow death, saying that she would rather drink and die than be admitted to a detox unit. And as she went on, she was driven to a social worker to her parents' home, but then she wound up going back to her parents' home. And as she went back to her parents' home, even this wasn't rock bottom, as she joined her alcoholic parents in going out here and continuing to go out here and drink. So it was really sad to see your Barbara Payton go from being an extremely attractive woman to becoming a woman in crisis. And as she became this woman in crisis, she was living in her parents' home, drinking practically every day, and her face had a perpetual sunburn. She was heavy and weighed close to 200 pounds, and she just looked like a completely different person. She went from being, again, a woman that every guy looked at and wanted to get with it as a model, to becoming an obese alcoholic. And basically, this is what happens to women in crisis. Again, this is what happens to a lot of women who don't want to deal with their problems. And in the case of Barbara Payton, she just got bit by that Hollywood bug. She got bit by that acting bug. She did not want to submit to the authority of a husband. She did not want to be a wife. And because she wanted the attention of Hollywood and wanted to be a part of the Hollywood scene, she got turned out and instead of becoming a starlet, she became a bust down. And as she became a bust down, she just became completely busted. And even on the road to decline, she basically went further lower into rock bottom, and eventually wound up losing her life in her parents' home, where she died of heart and liver failure at the age of 39. And it's just really sad to see the story of Barbara Payton, because she's a textbook example of everything I talk about as related to women following the feminist paradigm, and following that feminist paradigm all the way until she eventually wound up becoming a bust down in Bust Downtown. And as she was a bust down, she was looking at the graveyard from the view of her parents' home. And as she looked at the graveyard in her parents' home, she wound up eventually becoming another resident in the graveyard. Now, the third woman whose road to stardom led to her becoming a woman in crisis was actress Veronica Lake. And sadly, actress Veronica Lake's road to becoming a woman in crisis started early in her childhood. Now, your Veronica Lake was originally born Constance Frances Marie Okelman in Brooklyn. And her road to crisis started when her father wound up dying in an oil tanker explosion in Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania in 1932. Now, your Veronica Lake's mother, Frances Charlotta, wound up marrying Anthony Kane, a newspaper staff artist, and began using his surname, and she became Constance Kane. Now, Constance Kane, according to her mother, had a troubled childhood and was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and this possibly was one of the reasons why she wound up getting expelled from an all-girls Catholic boarding school, and wound up struggling until the family moved to Beverly Hills, California. Now, when the family moved to Beverly Hills, California, your Constance Kane enrolled in an acting farm at the Bliss Hayden School of Acting, and was discovered when she and a friend went to an audition at RKO and did some screen tests as an extra for RKO, and then did some small roles for them before eventually winding up starring in the film I Wanted Wings. And when she got into this role, the director changed her name to Veronica Lake, and that's how your Constance Kane wound up becoming Veronica Lake. And this is where she started on the road to becoming a woman in crisis, because as she started acting in movies, she started to drink to socialize. And as she was going out here drinking to socialize, eventually this became the crutch that she carried as she got involved with her husbands and then wound up having issues in her life. Now, your Veronica Lake is known for her classic iconic peekaboo hairstyle where her hair falls over one eye, and this hairstyle was considered a major popular hairstyle in the 1940s. But your Veronica Lake says that she felt that the hair fell over her right eye because she had her arm on a table and it slipped and it just fell over her face. Now, she says she came up with this hairstyle by an accident, but this hairstyle became an icon because I Wanted Wings was a hit movie, and this hairstyle that Veronica Lake had was copied by many women. And I even was inspired to give Eastine, the character in the John Haynes and Eastine books, that hairstyle because it was inspired by Veronica Lake's hairstyle over where she had the hair over her right eye, but usually when I do Eastine, I have it over her left eye. So that hairstyle became something that she was known for, and she was known so much for this hairstyle that the government actually asked her to stop wearing this hairstyle because many women who were copying her were working in the factories during World War II, and as they were working in the factories with these hairstyles, they were getting hurt on the job. Some were getting their hair caught in machines that they were working on. Others were hitting on walls and falling down. And they asked Veronica Lake to stop wearing this hairstyle. And when she stopped wearing this hairstyle, this is what led to the start of the decline of her career, along with her reputation for being difficult on the set of many projects. And your Veronica Lake was known by some producers as being that bee, and others called her Veronica Lake, and they called her this because of her lack of professionalism on the set. And that lack of professionalism, along with the change in hairstyle, led to the decline of Veronica Lake's acting career, and it also coincided with her financial issues that she and her husband at the time, Alex de Toth, were having. And as a result, your Veronica Lake went from being a woman who was a struggling actress to becoming a woman in crisis that fit the profile that I talk about in the chapter Bust Downtown. Now, after her career started to decline with the film The Blue Dahlia, which did not do well, what happened was that she could not get much more work with Paramount, who decided to renew her contract. And by about 1950, your Veronica Lake stopped being popular because in 1951, this is when Lake and de Toth filed for bankruptcy, and sadly the IRS wound up seizing their home for unpaid taxes. And your Veronica Lake, who was on the point of a nervous breakdown and bankrupt, she then flew away from Hollywood, and in a plane that she had basically bought for her husband, because she had also got her pilot's license when she was in Hollywood, and flew alone to New York. Now, she said people said she was going to come back in a couple of months to Hollywood, but she realized that there was enough was enough. But what happened to her was she wound up in New York, and she went to go and try to rebuild her life, where for a while she did summer stock in England before winding up passing out in Detroit when she was doing some stage theater. Now, after her third divorce from Alex de Toth, she then started drifting in life from cheap hotels in New York City and wound up in the place I call Bust Downtown. And in Bust Downtown, she was down there. She had been arrested several times for public drunkenness and disorderly conduct. And she was basically living in an all-women's hotel in Manhattan, working as a waitress in the cocktail lounge far away from her children. And she was working at that job because she said she liked people.
and like to talk to them. But basically, I believe she was just struggling with dealing with the fact that her career in Hollywood was over, her marriage had ended, and as she was sitting at this hotel with a metaphorical view of the graveyard, she was just waiting, running the clock out on her life because she was possibly frustrated about the direction of her life. Even though she was paying a $190 a month rent on this hotel room, she wasn't poor, but her perception of self had been so bad as related to the decline of her career that this is what led to her winding up in a state as related to her own self image. And it's that self image that I believe led to her starting to go out here and drink more frequently because, in order to cope, many women, when they go out here, they become women in crisis because they start going out here and looking to turn to a bottle of spirits to lift their spirits as related to a stressful situation. And as your Veronica Lake was dealing with the stress of no longer being a star and being the center of attention, she looked to go out here and deal with her stresses through drinking them away. And she had to deal with this. Again, she was out here trying to just go out here and make a living at this job as a waitress and just going through the motions as under the name Connie DeToth because she just could not deal with the whole issue as related to the entertainment industry and how they basically turned her out. Now, as your Veronica Lake was spotted, people thought she was poor, but she wasn't poor. She was just, her mind wasn't in the right place because she had basically been abandoned by Hollywood. Things didn't work out as related to her marriage, and things didn't work out in her life. So she basically wound up in solitude, drinking to try to cope with things, and began feeling even more guilty about going out here and not being able to spend time with her children. And she says that her mother pushed her into being an actress, which basically led to her winding up becoming this woman in crisis. And she felt like she was, instead of being a sex symbol, she felt like she was a zombie because she felt detached and disconnected from life. And that's what happens to many of the women in crisis. They oftentimes feel disconnected and detached, and they feel disconnected and detached because they feel like they're not able to have a relationship with people because what happens in their relationships is that they're not seen as a human being. They're not able to bond with people as a human being. So what happens to them is that they become drifting through life, basically existing and not living. And that's basically what happened to Veronica Lake. She was drifting through life and coping with her issues with a bottle. And she was coping with those issues with a bottle and trying to just deal with them, working jobs here and there. And as she worked here and there, she basically, again, drifted away from her family, disconnected from her children, disconnected from practically everyone, and wound up basically feeling completely alone. And again, sadly, she wound up, while she was the woman who was on lots of posters as the girl everybody dreamed of getting with, sadly, before she wound up doing some acting, she wound up traveling in Vermont where she complained of stomach pains and then found out she had cirrhosis of the liver from all of the drinking that she did, and then wound up going to the University of Vermont Medical Center, where sadly she died of acute hepatitis and a kidney injury in 1973. And what was really sad about Veronica Lake is that she was so far away from the people who loved her that she had no connection to them, because while she was out here, a woman out here being a star, she was not connected to anyone, and she was basically all alone because she had nobody to love her and she had nobody to care for her. She was basically out here by herself. I mean, yes, she was the independent woman who had all of the success and all of the fame, but she had no one to share it with, and that's what leads to many women in crisis going and falling into depression, where they look to go out here and cope with their issues of loneliness and depression by going out here and seeking out some spirits in a bottle. And again, this happens to many of these women out here today, right now. Many of these women today, right now, are on the same road as a Gail Russel or a Barbara Payton or a Veronica Lake. I mean, when I look at your Barbara Payton, she reminds me so much of Britney Spears right now. And when I look at Gail Russell, she was a shrinking violet who was an introvert. Again, and your Veronica Lake, all of them had great success as related to their professional careers, but their personal lives were in shambles because they just didn't know how to function as women, and because they grew up in dysfunctional households, they eventually grew up to become women in crisis. And sadly, all three of these women sadly became fitting the pattern that I talk about in the chapter Alcoholism and the Woman Crisis. And as they succumbed to alcoholism, they became women in crisis who never hit rock bottom and were able to bounce back, but sadly wound up hitting rock bottom that put them 6 feet under. And that is the sad part about the stories of all three of these women, who all again fit that pattern and profile for women in crisis, and shows us even before the feminist movement there have been historical women in crisis. And these historical women in crisis, while they had success in Hollywood, they weren't able to live the abundant life that the Most High had for them, because they were never at peace. And they were never at peace because they kept trying to fit themselves into a world where everything just kept constantly changing. And because they didn't know how to cope with that change, they wound up falling further and further behind until they eventually fell into the abyss that led to them, and with their lives ending as women in crisis. Now, if you want to learn more about what leads to a woman winding up becoming on the road to becoming a woman in crisis, you can pick up my book, The Woman Crisis, on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find The Woman Crisis on other online booksellers like Smashwords, the iBookstore, and Google Play. And that book on digital versions will be available on November 29th, but you can get the paperback version right now. And if you want to see me do more videos on the historical women in crisis, you can send a donation to the Cash App, the Patreon, or the PayPal. And if you present me with a woman in crisis that I know something about, I will make that video for you. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.
Now available in paperback and Kindle Unlimited, The Man Crisis. Learn why so many men are struggling to find their way in an increasingly gynocentric world in The Man Crisis. Get your copy of The Man Crisis in paperback and Kindle Unlimited today.